Hello, everyone. Welcome to the space. It's great to be here. My name is Maylis. I use she and her pronouns. I'm currently based in Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa. Hope you can see me or hear me okay. But for anyone who needs a bit of a visual description, I'm a Black cisgender female presenting person. I have black Afro hair, wear a pair of patterned glasses, wearing this kind of white kind of stripy top, and sitting in what looks like a birdcage, but it's actually my chair. So if you've seen me before, if you've been in these spaces previously, you probably have seen me before. But I work as a transformational coach and consultant, and I also wear and have the amazing responsibility of being the program director of We Create Space. What we'll do is maybe share a bit more information for those of you who are new to the space and don't know about us. We are a community-led platform and a consultancy, really this powerful collective of queer change makers on a mission to improve the lives of LGBTQ+ people around the world. And we currently support, I think, right over 100 businesses, corporate partners as well, at varying levels of their DEI journey. And we really do this through consultancy, shared learning experiences, producing DEI insights, and really crafting bespoke content that support individuals with strengthening their roles as change agents, as advocates within their communities and organizations. And as a social enterprise, the profit that we make from doing this work, well, with the support of our corporate partners, of course, goes back into the LGBTQIA+ community, providing free events like this one, also events in person, free resources, leadership development opportunities, and well-being solutions. And we're so proud to have, over the last 2 years, been able to deliver over 1,000 events and shared experiences and invested more than £350,000 back into the LGBTQ+ community. So we'd love for you to continue showing up, and we'd love to continue doing this. And there's a couple of things we want to invite you to see how you can potentially get involved. The first thing we'd love for you to do is keep doing what you're doing right now, is showing up, come to our events. Also share our events and content across, your social media, sharing those social posts, amplifying our speakers and their projects. And if you feel like there is an alignment there with the conversations we bring, introduce us to your employer or your colleagues. So I'm going to pause there. We're going to put the slides away. And this is just me taking a little bit of additional time to, again, inviting you to sit back, engage, connect with this conversation. I'm so pleased to be bringing this topic forward of bodily autonomy and how it impacts the future of inclusion. We will be talking about our relationship with our body, how we see our body in connection to the way, we create value, we produce, we engage, the spaces we interact, and even how these freedoms that we hold surrounding our body, how they're perceived, and the dynamics that creates. So obviously, that can potentially bring up some challenging emotions and even memories as well. And we encourage you to engage with the session in a way that supports your well-being. From our side, as team members and facilitators, we'll do our best to issue our trigger warnings when needed. But the focus effectively for this conversation in this space is to offer solution-focused perspectives and tools really that you can take away to drive positive change and transformation in your community and workplaces. I'm going to pass on now to our amazing moderator, Lisa Marie, who will kick off an introduction for herself, but also invite other panelists to introduce themselves later on. But what you can do as well as participants, I see some are doing that in the chat. Please tell us your name, your pronouns, where you're joining from, something interesting you want to share with this community today about yourself, how you're showing up. You're more than welcome to do that. Look forward to hearing some of your reflections and connecting a bit later. Thank you so much. Over to you, Lisa Marie.
Thank you so much, Maylis, and it's a real pleasure to meet you all today. My name is Lisa. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white, middle-aged, shortish woman with glasses and a two-tone mohawk today that's just been freshly cut, and a colourful sports top. And I am coming as part of the conversation today from the world of wellbeing. I'm a wellbeing coordinator and also a personal development coach, and a huge advocate of nonviolent communication. So I'm a big advocate for connection, and I'm hoping today there'll be lots of connection that we can make between ourselves and you as well. So we are going to talk about bodily autonomy and make a space for this, and hopefully some awareness and some solutions, as Melis previously said. This is a live panel discussion, and we are looking at how can we champion bodily autonomy, and also how we can find the support and the resources in order to bring that to our workplace, but in a meaningful way, in a respectful way. And so this conversation is exploring the definitions of bodily autonomy, but also reflections of lived and experience from our panelists. So what I would love to start today is to actually invite you to contribute and connect with you. And I'd love to do an opening poll with you. So I wonder, Trish, could you facilitate the first slide so we can have a look at what we've got here? So if you are able and willing, we offer you to scan the QR code, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, hopefully, and for you to click the link and chat. And what we'd love to do is to reflect on what systems and norms permit and restrict bodily autonomy. Now, our definition for today that we're going to start with is bodily autonomy is describing the freedoms and informed choices that each person has the right to make about and for their body at any time. So we will discuss the definitions, but firstly, I'd love to hear what your reflections are, and how much you reflect on what a system and what a norm might permit and restrict for a sense of bodily autonomy. So if you're able to scan the code and put in your thoughts, we will see what you say, and then we will start to collate that and see if we can see that any words or thoughts that are coming to the fore. So while you spend a little bit of time doing that, I'm going to just talk a little bit about this umbrella term of bodily autonomy, and we said freedoms and informed choices. And it's interesting, even looking at the words coming through, that we do think about state repression, we do think about borders, we think about people moving, and interesting how governments, politics, laws and colonialism is now coming forward from your responses, which very much speak to that. Very similarly, talking about access to cares and services and well-being, obviously sort of the work that I do. So interesting that mental health and also how governments are going to facilitate cares and services too seem to be at the forefront there as well. The media, religion and laws are coming forward as a powerful in terms of like how we think about the freedom to choose how we form families, for example, and in expressing gender, and obviously how that will depend on which governance your country or your culture or your society or your community may have. And government is getting bigger and bigger, and politics is closely followed behind. But some very other interesting comments there from you, particularly the concept of clothing availability, diet culture, things that are very fetishizing fit bodies, for example, and really working on and fat phobia, really working on our physical human structure that we carry around with us every day, as well as then all the systems around that. So stereotyping, patriarchy, for example, and the expectations of society. It still seems that the governance is winning out at the moment. So if I'll give you another 10-20 seconds if you have anything to add, but I think that is a fantastic collection of internal and external views on our sense of bodily autonomy. I'm going to pause there if that's possible. Thank you so much. And thank you much, Trish, for sorting that out. I would like to take some of those thoughts, particularly about government and governance, and I will bring that part of our panel later on today. But I would like to firstly invite the panelists who are going to inform the chat for the rest of our session together. We have Jalinda, we have Jude, and we have Doug with us today. And obviously I would love to invite them to introduce themselves. So Jalinda, as you popped onto my screen first, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jalinda Johnson. My pronouns are she, they. I am a mixed Black woman wearing glasses and a very colorful print dress, although it looks like a button-down shirt. And I have salt and pepper hair, not quite a mohawk, but definitely short. I am a certified life coach and certified holistic health coach who specializes in burnout and perimenopause. So I basically work with chronically stressed people in midlife who are navigating the world of their changing hormones and trying to figure out how they can make peace with their changing body so that they can continue having impact in the world. And I am specifically interested in changing the narrative around menopause when it comes to the population in general, but especially the LGBTQ plus community whose voices are often ignored in the conversation, as well as those under 45.
Fabulous, thank you. And what amazing work that you do.
Thank you.
I definitely would like to chat more. Could I move on to Doug, as you're next on my screen, for you to introduce yourself? Thank you, Doug.
For sure. Thank you, Lisa Marie. So hi, everyone. My name is Doug A. Grafio. I use they, them pronouns. I am a Venezuelan mixed-race, non-binary person with a lived experience of migration and class struggle. I am light-skinned, I have a beard, I am wearing duochrome eyeshadow, and I have a light pink sweatshirt on. I am a speaker, writer, and human rights defender working in the field of LGBTQI plus rights for many years now. I started doing this work when I was living in Venezuela and then continued when I was living in Canada, and now I'm doing it at the European level, and I'm based in Barcelona, but I am currently in Berlin. I am currently working as the officer for the Equal Rights Coalition. I coordinate the engagement of its civil society co-chairs with its 42 member states. And I have also been working closely with We Create Space for almost a year now on all topics of radical and intersectional justice. And I'm very happy to be here with all of you today to talk about this topic that means a lot to me personally.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Doug. And finally, Jude.
Hi everyone, my name's Jude. I'm a trans and non-binary person. My pronouns are they, them. I am a LGBTQIA plus trans and non-binary awareness and inclusion speaker and trainer. I'm also a campaigner and I do some work on social media as well. Just a visual description, I am a white trans masculine person with brown hair. I have some facial hair and I'm wearing an open black shirt with a white vest. And my background has mainly been in education, so working with young people for around 10 years. And I've specialized specifically in supporting trans non-binary young people over the last 7 years or so, and regularly working in schools, but also with businesses, brands, companies, wherever I can, and whoever will have me to essentially advocate for the community, but more specifically, really hopefully pave the way for the next generation and support them and actually speak for them and hopefully empower them to actually be their authentic selves, you know, and an experience that I unfortunately didn't have. And so my interest is in really supporting the next generation as much as I possibly can in whichever platform or whatever platform I have to do that.
Fabulous. Thank you for the incredibly important work you all do for that and for those introductions. I was asked the question about bodily autonomy, and as a queer person, but also working in wellbeing with a variety of clients, my response sort of formed a quote that I used to sort of initiate some of the questions today. And this is very much based on what I'm beginning to see from the clients that I work with, and a sort of a sense of how people are understanding autonomy. If the queer body itself is a source of anxiety and fear internally, then one may have trouble finding an external perspective on what is classed as safe. And therefore, that can be a major obstacle in achieving a sense of autonomy. Now, this was my starting point, and this was my own personal lived-in experience as a starting point. And this is how I'm framing some of our questions, and now I invite the panelists to respond. We have an initial question, which is around assumption making, which obviously forms a big part of what we're here to understand today. So I would love to know from you all, what are the assumptions we think people make about feeling safe inside one's own body? So could I perhaps go to Doug first and have a think about the assumptions that people might make?
For sure. Thank you so much. I think this is a very wonderful question with which to begin our panel. And when it comes to bodily autonomy, I think we should think very critically about all the ways in which this issue becomes relevant in our day-to-day lives, especially in this current day and age. I would think most of us are familiar with the feminist concepts of no means no, and the wider conversations around consent and physical touch and interaction. However, I personally think there is ample room to expand on this notion of bodily autonomy and cover other aspects of our social and political lives beyond what is traditionally discussed in conversations about bodily autonomy. For instance, and speaking as a femme non-binary person who presents in a way that people don't typically assume a non-binary person with my lived experience looks like, it often gets pretty frustrating when people try to engage or interact with me in the same way that they would with a cisgender man, expecting a whole set of behaviors merely based on the way that I look like. In my experience, these types of interactions often have the effect of making us feel reclusive or even avoid social situations at times, just because we'd rather not deal with the weight of not being seen for who we really are, or having our bodies be interacted with in ways that make us feel uncomfortable or invalidate and even negate who we actually are. So in other words, just because we look one way and fit the visual model of what others may be attracted to, that doesn't mean that we're actually willing to fulfill those desires and fantasies of often sexual interaction. So I think it's a good exercise for us all to always try to ask all those cuties we want to engage with, what are the right ways to touch them and love them and appreciate them, rather than assuming that all similar bodies must be enjoyed the same way. And as well, another aspect that I see as key to discussions of bodily autonomy is how we interact with disability and different levels of ability and energy within our community. For me, as someone who struggles with chronic back pain, it can get pretty frustrating when I see that events and venues do not have adequate seating options. And when they do have them, they often do not offer proper back support, because at a bar, they may only have stools, or you may have to sit on the floor, or seats are very limited. And there's often a competition for who gets to sit down and put their drink somewhere so no one else sits there, So understanding that we all have different relationships to our bodies is crucial if we aim to create inclusive spaces where everyone feels welcome, and therefore being attuned to the different needs, ability, and energy levels of our community members can definitely have an impact on how involved those of us facing marginalization in this aspect can become. This to me is an issue of bodily autonomy, because if we often have to balance the needs of our own bodies with having a social life, and if we give into one aspect a bit too much, we may compromise on the other one in a way that ends up hurting us a bit, So the choice often is to stay home where we can ensure our comfort and safety, or to try to have a social life and form community while sacrificing the care and attention that our bodies need. And I don't think it's fair that we make people with different ability or energy levels choose between taking care of their bodies or being able to have friends. And there is definitely room for us to practice self-reflection and see how we can all do better to make our spaces more welcoming and inclusive.
That's a brilliant answer, and absolutely speaks to that idea of having to make those choices, being forced to make those choices, and something that a lot of people may not have even considered before. Just before this, Jude and I were just chatting about the actual definition of autonomy. I would love to hear your thought on that, following on from Doug's comments.
Yeah, we were discussing and thank you so much, Doug. I mean, how do I follow on from that? Quite honestly, incredible to hear you speak, and it's given me so much to think about as well. But in terms of the definition of what autonomy actually stands for, I mean, we were talking about sort of the difference between freedom and rights, and the fact that actually so many of our rights have been stripped away from us. I mean, especially talking on behalf of the trans community worldwide, and the different intersections that exist within the community as well, young people and children as well, specifically. And so actually our autonomy, our bodily autonomy, our rights to that are being stripped away. And And that's quite concerning. And so even kind of thinking about the assumptions that people make, even that word assumption to me directly contradicts the idea of autonomy, because if people are making assumptions on others' behalf, and we've spoken so eloquently, Doug spoke so eloquently about us all having different experiences, and it's fundamental for us to have an awareness of those experiences, of each other's experiences, without automatically categorizing people. But unfortunately, I feel that we live in a society where we've been programmed to do that, and that's what we need to kind of condition ourselves out of. It's almost like a process of unlearning, and I've had to do that within myself. I lived in a body that I felt uncomfortable with, but was completely unaware of my own discomfort for 3 decades of my life. It took me until I was 30 to even recognize that I could possibly be uncomfortable in my body despite all the signs and symptoms. And that just goes to show just how insidious social conditioning actually is. You know, from the very start of our lives, before we even have the ability to communicate, another person decides our gender for us, our identity, who we're going to be. And that kind of sets the tone of all this kind of conditioning, this process that we go through in life. And luckily enough, I've been able to become aware of that. It's given me an enormous insight, I'd say. And so I'm grateful for that. However, I do feel that we need to work together and really have these discussions. But I was thinking about the definition, sorry, I'll leave it here as well, about autonomy. To me, feels like having my own autonomy feels like feeling at home in my skin, you know, and that's how it feels to have my own bodily autonomy. And yeah, so.
That's fantastic. Okay, thank you. We'll definitely come back to that sort of the discomfort, I think, and that social conditioning. I think that can form a bit part of our conversation later on. Gillinda, would you like to sort of tell me about what you think about the assumptions that people might make, given particularly the work that you do?
Well, I was just thinking about what Jude just said, that it took them until their 30s to realize they were uncomfortable in their bodies. Did I hear you correctly, Jude? Yeah, and it took me until my 40s to feel truly comfortable in my body. And looking at the poll and the words that were coming up, you know, capitalism, patriarchy, you know, racism, colonialism. I was just having a moment there, but these are systems that teach us not to feel safe in our bodies, systematically not to feel safe in our bodies. And so as a queer Black woman, it's taken me decades to feel like I actually have the freedom to take up space, but both physically and metaphorically, that I don't shrink away from people, or, you know, that I can even share my opinion without making it more palatable, for example. But when I was listening to Doug, what was coming up was, you know, how difficult it is to take care of something that we perceive as a threat. And so many of us are conditioned to think of our bodies as threatening, especially when they don't fit into this, you know, ideal, so to speak. And in terms of assumptions, I think we assume that people who we perceive to have different needs are going to recognize those needs and also advocate for themselves. Because I know that, for example, I was born with a club foot. So I've always been differently abled. But I've worked most of my life to try to hide that, you know, not to advocate for myself, but to make it seem like I am no different than anyone else. You know, we know that people who have invisible disabilities, especially at work, and instead of saying, you know, actually, I need a different setup, or I would work better in a different environment, or this schedule, we actually override our body's needs and push harder to see, you know, to show everyone that we can keep up, that we're no different. And I think that a big part of bodily autonomy is recognizing that actually I have different needs, I'm worthy of those needs, and I will not be discriminated against for having them. And unfortunately, that's not the reality for a lot of people at work, because, you know, unfortunately, a lot of us are discriminated against for raising our hand and saying this doesn't work for me. And especially in midlife and the menopause space that I'm always in, there are a lot of people who are going through perimenopause who don't even realize that it is perimenopause, and much less feel comfortable talking about it with their line managers, for example. So, yeah, that would be my contribution to that question.
That's a wonderful contribution. Thank you. There's lots there. The body as threat and overriding those needs, I think, is quite a powerful sentiment. But I also really was fascinated you're pinpointing the word systems, actually, and I want to sort of connect the same as the poll that we did, and how governance, government and politics and how healthcare systems came out as one of the sort of the driving factors here. So with that in mind, and the systems that Jalinda just sort of mentioned, could perhaps we get a little bit of insight from each one of you as to what sort of aspects of LGBTQ plus life can call into question that sense of the body as threat, or those needs needing to be overridden. Perhaps it's something connected to your opinion of state, of oppression, repression, but also governance within systems within your own country. Do you think I could go to Jude, to you first with that?
I mean, I automatically think of the accessibility to healthcare, but also the recognition of dysphoria. I spoke of the fact that I was unaware of my own discomfort, but it was there. And I was experiencing that particularly as my body was changing. And unfortunately, my body was working against me in the sense that, I began to feel unsafe, and there were physical signs to that I sort of carried with me, such as hunching of the shoulders. And so various ways that I'd alleviate that discomfort. But that was entire. I was the trans kid that slipped through the net. No one acknowledged that within me. No one supported me through that. And so I found ways to kind of alleviate the discomfort, and felt incredibly unsafe in my body for a number of years. And so kind of returning back to that and really reclaiming that autonomy has been an integral part of becoming my true and authentic self later in life. And it's something that I believe that everyone should have the right and the human right, actually, to access support around that, whatever that may look like for the individual, but speaking on behalf of someone that experienced dysphoria specifically, and of course, and support, which we know is severely underfunded in this country for the trans community. And so that's certainly something that I feel that needs to be addressed. And certainly something that later in life I've been able to align myself to, in the sense of feeling more comfortable and safe. But yeah, there are still conditions that I carry with me. There are still the sort of scars, emotional scars of the past, that haven't fully enabled me to feel truly comfortable in myself, and I maybe never will. But that's certainly something that I feel answers that question. Thank you.
Doug, can I come to you as well with that question, talking about systems and what aspects of LGBTQ life you think actually cause it to question that sense of safety in a body, or sense that your body is a threat and overriding needs? Is there something you'd like to discuss regarding crossing borders and sort of how the relationship you have with governance?
For sure. Well, I usually love talking about state oppression and repression, but my answer, I think, would be more about interpersonal relationships and LGBTQI community life. And there's one thing that Jude mentioned about reclaiming your autonomy that really just made me think, because I think that reclamation of like taking a stand and saying, you know what, like enough is enough. I'm going to stop following that social script of what we should want and what we should actually, aspire to be, and reflect by ourselves on what actually makes us happy and what actually makes us whole, and live unapologetic lives where we chase that determination of our own happiness, And that's where I see the issue of bodily autonomy, that I want to separate it from these very capitalistic neoliberal understandings of individualism, because I don't think autonomy is the same as being individualistic. I think there's still a room for community life within an autonomous view of us as human beings. But my point is that as I grow older, I realize that I am less and less willing to compromise my own safety, my needs, and my well-being just for being part of some LGBTQ plus space or circle. I think when I was younger and I didn't have this degree of self-awareness and confidence, I put myself in many dangerous and unwanted situations just because I wanted to belong and be part of something. And as I was saying before, LGBTQ plus inclusion shouldn't come at the expense of compromising on the things that we need to be happy and at peace. As a fat person, one of the main sources of violence that I experience is the dual explicit and implicit fat phobia and the hierarchy of bodies that takes place in virtually all LGBTQ plus spaces. It doesn't matter how deconstructed, how feminist, how intersectional they are, they always have these dynamics within them. It is something that you truly need to be fat to understand, because usually those who are not fat will just tell you some feel-good neoliberal spiel about, oh, just be yourself, just feel hot in your own body. You don't need validation from others. But I think that is easily said by those who are at the top of this bodily desire hierarchy scale that I'm talking about. And those of us who occupy less normative bodies can relate to what it feels like to immediately be desexualized when you enter most LGBTQ plus spaces. Because you can usually tell that people don't even look you in the eye in the same way that they do to non-fat people. And this can cause us to spiral and definitely has an impact on how safe and included we feel within LGBTQ plus spaces. And even though there are alternatives, like perhaps events and collectives organized by people in bare communities, for instance, these are often usually only attended by cis men. And with the social rules and expectations that I was explaining before of male socialization and sexualization, where people assume that you're willing to be touched and loved in the same way as a cis man just because you look like one. So while we have discussions about bodily autonomy, I think it's a good exercise in reflection for all LGBTQ plus people to think about why and how we may inadvertently or even explicitly pit bodies against each other and contribute to these hierarchies of desire that inherently render fat people, as well as trans people, disabled people, older folks, as inherently less sexual and less desirable and less hot in plain terms, than their more normative counterparts, because these dynamics are always replicated within LGBTQ plus spaces and affect how safe and welcome we may feel within them. For instance, if you organize parties for LGBTQ plus people, are you booking fat performers, fat go-go dancers, fat drag queens? And I don't mean like with a slight belly or slightly chunky. I mean actually fat in ways that are not normative. People with stretch marks, with hanging bellies, with cellulite. Because we often see that there is some degree of fat inclusion, but it's still towards those with relatively acceptable ways of being fat, like just barely thick. And, at the end of the day, no one is forcing anyone to have sex with a fat person if they don't want to. Like, I personally wouldn't want someone to feel obligated to interact with me in that way if they're not into it, just to fulfill some social, like, altruistic mission. But I do think we all have a responsibility to think about how our interactions and our expectations and our ways of socialization may automatically render some people as less valuable, less beautiful, or less desirable than others.
Thank you, Doug. That was I can see in the chat there's a huge number of people that thought your response was fantastic. So thank you. I'm going to take your concept of sort of hierarchies of bodies and pass this on to Jalinda. We move on to sort of best practices now and how we can kind of challenge these assumptions. I would love to ask Jalinda, sort of thinking about how we challenge these assumptions that people may or may not be making. What do you think are the sort of best practices to use around this topic in the workplace? Because I think that the hierarchy is a really interesting one to sort of slightly pick apart, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, specifically in the workplace, I'm giving a talk next week about menopause in the workplace. And so I've really been deep in reading articles about just how to create a transparent menopause policy. And I think that that can be applied to, transparency overall, instead of making it about certain people in other words, if I use menopause as an example, instead of targeting only those who are going through perimenopause, which again may not even recognize that they're going through perimenopause, have that be part of the mental health week, a workshop about menopause as part of the mental health week. Have someone who is a menopause well-being champion, who is someone other than a line manager that people would feel comfortable speaking to, reaching out to. Having articles circulate on a regular basis, as opposed to just on a specific day, or so that there's already this conversation happening, and also one-on-one meetings that are just regularly in place, so that you're not calling someone in to talk about their perimenopause symptoms. It's, you're already seeing people on a weekly or fortnightly basis, checking in and how they're doing. And if you have a knowledge around, for example, neurodivergence, perimenopause, disability, the differently abled accommodations that need to happen, that, again, not everyone who's differently abled or disabled is going to advocate for themselves, unfortunately. And so if you can educate, if you are an able person, for example, and you can educate yourself around what might need to happen, then you can actually meet them in creating something that's going to feel supportive. I found a really interesting example today, that it was a self-identification form that listed, again, this is for menopause, but perimenopause takes away so much bodily autonomy, just because of the wide range of symptoms. That's why I keep talking about it. But it listed the symptom, the location. So does it happen at home? Does it happen at work? The severity, the frequency, and then examples of adjustments. So like, imagine that this is something that was distributed to all employees, regardless of whether, because if you live with women or work with women, you're going to have, or I should say, if you live with someone with ovaries or work with someone with ovaries, you're going to have, contact with someone who goes through perimenopause. Trans women also experience symptoms of menopause as a result of hormone therapy, if they choose that, and trans men as well. So it's, but having it be something that everyone receives, not just when you notice that someone's having a problem, so that it becomes part of the culture. Because if someone is really struggling, but they are in a workplace where this is just, being circulated as part of the regular practice, it's not going to feel taboo. And, if you're a leader in a space who can normalize your own challenges, then that gives other people permission to speak more openly and to feel like, okay, well, maybe I can request a change to my work environment. Maybe it could be something as simple as, working a different time of day, working from home one day a week, having your camera off if necessary, having an area, if you're always working with the public and front facing, having an area where you can just take a 5-minute break, to rest. Things that, we take for granted, I think, but can really make a big difference in terms of the level of control that you have over your work environment. And
I love that proactivity, that proactive stance that you're taking. I'm aware of time, and making a bit of time for some question and answers. So I would like to just give some space to Jude and to Doug to sort of also have their input as to what sort of either challenging assumptions and how we can navigate that, and or the best practices? Do you think we're able to sort of perhaps go to Jude first and go, what are your ways of challenging assumptions around either personal sense of safety or dealing with this sort of sense of hierarchy of bodies?
In terms of, I think what's been shared, especially with regards to creating a culture in the workplace, I've heard a lot about culture, and currently as it stands, a recent statistic is that 2/3 of trans people hide their identity at work, which is reflective of the fact that most trans people don't feel comfortable being their authentic selves, and so there's not a culture that encourages autonomy. And I'm just kind of drawing upon what Doug was saying about the need to belong and the want to belong, and often people compromising their autonomy in order to do that. I feel that can be very common, and so what we're looking for is to really create a culture that actually facilitates a safe space for people to be able to explore who they are. Like, I didn't know for many years, and so often it's you know that the individual in question might not even be aware. And so I think it's important that education and training is a big part of basically enforcing that, of facilitating that, and ensuring that that's also outsourced as well. So it's not just colleagues that are relied to kind of facilitate that. I'm always looking for visual cues. I'm somebody that I'd say is lucky enough to be able to step into my man box because of the way that I present, you know, and I have the privilege and safety of that often. However, I also strive to be as authentic as I possibly can and be myself. And so what I'd like to see is, you know, an environment that really does facilitate that. And so, you know, that can be done in the form of celebration. Visibility is hugely important, but creating groups and safe spaces that people can access as well. Guidelines and policies, transitioning in the workplace policies, for example, that just give a set of guidelines to everyone as to, you know, what's not just what's expected of them, but where they can access support. And so that's what I think.
That's yeah, I'm very powerful. Thank you. And lastly, Doug. Challenging assumptions, best practices. What are your thoughts, having heard Jalinda and Jude?
Sure. So to me, you know, this is intimately tied to like the future of LGBTQ plus inclusion, you know, like that topic of bodily autonomy and how we reimagine spaces and policies. So I hear both Jalinda as well as someone, Neil, in the chat talking about the pandemic and like the flexibility of now that some people have of turning their camera off and like taking breaks on their own terms, working from bed, all these things. Like, I think it's really important as a reclamation of comfort and of our own needs, you know. I think the concept of bodily autonomy is so crucial in our day and age because, at least in my opinion, we're at a time where people are examining how much they are willing to let go of themselves and their needs just for the comfort of others or to fulfill some sort of societal script. And this often has bodily dimensions that aren't usually discussed under the framework of bodily autonomy. I know that we need to be mindful of time, but I'm going to try to wrap up as much as possible because I want to share something very important, that some of the greatest life lessons that I've ever learned came from in-depth engagement with the global intersex community when I was working at the Sex Characteristics program at ILGA World last year. As a queer person who has been doing activism for almost 15 years, I had assumed that I already knew everything there was to know about every letter in the LGBTQI+ acronym, and that the goals that each collective was fighting towards were basically the same, you know? And it was only by closely engaging with and actively listening to intersex people through compassion and kindness that I learned the many ways in which virtually all intersex people worldwide have had their bodily autonomy and integrity threatened by their families, the medical establishment, and even the state. And I think sometimes when we become so enmeshed in this queer world, we tend to assume we're all fighting for the same goals. But I think it's important that by staying in close communication with our peers and those who come from different walks of life, we reflect on why some collectives may have unique needs that escape our own realities and how we can best work alongside them to put an end to these systemic patterns of violence that many people oftentimes ignore. So, you know, inspired by everything I've learned from my dear intersex siblings, to me, the future of bodily autonomy is one that always centers the notion of nothing happens to my body without my expressed, informed, and continuous consent. And while we can definitely apply this to processes of medical and state violence, I think there's also room to extrapolate these ideas into other situations to ensure kinder and safer futures for us all. When it comes to the workplace, one thing that I appreciate from all the mess that the pandemic brought us is little glimpses of flexibility taking place in some work environments, obviously depending on the field, the income level, and the privilege. But I personally am very thankful that I have been working remotely for a few years now, which brings immense benefits to my life beyond just staying home, which people often assume it's, some sort of like privilege. Oh, you just get to stay home and rest all day, but it's deeper than that. For one, it guarantees my comfort and my well-being as someone with chronic pain, knowing that I can work and excel in my career from a space that is well attuned to my unique physical needs, as well as someone who struggles with anxiety and even agoraphobia at times. Not having to commute and face the dangers and discomfort of public transit, the streets, and office environments. Being able to work from home ensures my safety and keeps me away from potential triggers and dangers. And lastly, as a non-binary person, I can work from the safety of my own home in clothing and accessories that affirm my gender without having to conform to the unspoken rules of professionalism in the workforce, which often dictate very binary views on how you can present at an office or what is appropriate to wear when going to work. So even though the pandemic brought great sadness and despair to the world that we're still dealing with, I am thankful that it helped flexibilize the workforce by proving that going to the office wasn't actually that necessary for many people, and therefore allowing me and many others in my position to focus on and excel in our careers without worrying about all those externalities that threaten our minds, bodies, and souls by putting ourselves out there into the world. I think, just to conclude, we should all have an active say in what happens to our bodies, and I believe workplaces have a duty to ensure these conversations are taking place and the needs of their employees are being taken into account if they want to ensure their inclusion and happiness within their teams, especially so that queer people don't have to keep choosing between their own bodily comfort and the expectations of a society or of spaces that aren't well attuned to deal with our needs.
That's wonderful. Give you a round of applause for that, Doug. Thank you so much. Thank you to all three of you for your insights and certainly broadening my horizons. We've got a couple of questions, and I'd like to come to one first, if that's possible, which response from all of you would be wonderful if you can. The question was, what kind of top 5 practices would you recommend at a workplace with respect to hire to retire cycle while working with people from the LGBTQ+ community? Could I come to Jalinda? Can I come to you first? I've got a thought on that.
What kind of top 5 practices would you recommend at a workplace? Well, I think that when I think of the end of that hire to retire cycle, we really need to put a lot more emphasis on how we're retaining people who are over the age of 40, and also being willing to hire people who are over the age of 40, because there's still a huge discrimination there. Ageism is still very much at play, regardless of your sexual orientation. And I think we need to be willing to recognize all of the just the incredible value and wisdom and experience that people in differently abled bodies have to offer, and be willing as employers to make those modifications so that they can actually do their best, as opposed to not asking them directly, but definitely setting an expectation of, well, you have to fit into our framework and abandon your body in order to be part of our company culture. Because I think that's something that, unless it's where there's a policy and it's explicit, and again, going back to menopause, if a company doesn't have an explicit menopause policy, then most employees will, for example, when they take time off of work, they don't disclose that it's due to menopause. But if it's right there, then it's like, oh, well, that's valid. Like, this isn't something that I have to feel shame over. This isn't something that I have to hide. So as much as you can make explicit from the get-go and company-wide, as opposed to just targeting specific employees, because especially just thinking about disabilities and chronic illness, you might not have an invisible disability or chronic illness when you're hired in your 20s. And it might come up in midlife, and all of a sudden, Am I safe in this company? I don't know, because I was a different person, or I felt like I was a different person in a different body when I was hired. So, you know, as much as you can make that transparent from the get-go and have it in writing, and make sure that everyone is educated about those things, not just those who are directly affected. I think that's really fundamental.
Doug and Jude, do you think we could add one more practice from you each to add to that list to answer the question? Doug, would you like to add one?
Sure. I mean, like, think the concept of hire to retire is very intimately tied to what I was saying, you know. If your employees don't feel at home in your company, they are gonna quit. And we've seen that lately when we talk about like the great resignation and quiet quitting, like all these terms that are like very in trend right now. If you don't offer your employees and your team a place that they can feel safe and away from violence, they're gonna run to some other place that does give them these guarantees, you know? So flexible work and the ability to set your own times and to set your own location of work, this cannot be understated, you know? These are not just luxuries that some people may have. Like, this is something that everyone, depending on the work they do, obviously, they should be awarded, you know? And just as a takeaway, someone that I email all the time has in their email signature, like, my work schedule is my own. You feel free to reply at the times that work best for you or something like that, which I love because I work at the time that works best for me, you know, and I don't expect other people to reply at that same time. So I think that mentality of like, I am doing this when it works for me, you do your part when it works for you, I think it can really take us very far.
I will now be changing my email signature. Definitely. Jude, can we end with you just to add a best practice with regards to the hire to retire cycle?
Absolutely. And to me, I think a commitment to continuously look at how we can evolve the culture and review guidelines, policies, procedures. It's just a continuation. And in order to do that, we have to have the capacity to hold ourselves accountable on a regular basis and to kind of really step out of the shame of what that looks like and to actually make that commitment. So to continue evolving, you know, the environment in which we work, I'd say, on a very general sense.
That's wonderful. Thank you, all three of you. I hope all of you out there found that massively informative. I'm going to hand over to Melis now to sort of reflect on some key takeaways via Mentimeter, but that's a tech that is in far better hands than mine. So I'm going to hand over to Melis. It was a pleasure to chat to all the panelists today, and thank you so much for your wisdom and your insights. It affected me as much, and I hope it affected everybody else. Thank you.
It did indeed for me. Same. Thank you so much, Lisa and Jolinda, Doug, and Jude. I mean, there's so much that came up, and I'm going to ask Trish to actually share the screen so we can see some of the key takeaways. But from what I'm really looking at, I think that initial quote that we kicked off from Lisa, you know, really understanding if the body is a source of fear, then how do we now create this, you know, engagement and interaction externally and really go about achieving the sense of autonomy. And you know, we hear people here dropping down that, you know, kind of social conditioning being so insidious, and how that highlights and influences the relationships we have with our own body and how we view other people's freedoms around their own body, and you know, being able to kind of see as well that, you know, autonomy, Jude so beautifully said, is being able to feel free in one's own skin, and how that effectively is a fundamental right, but is being contested. And what can we do about this is ensuring that our culture really demonstrates behaviors that facilitates and empowers level of autonomy. And Jolinda talks so beautifully around, you know, unpacking policies, explaining, making sure everybody is part of the conversation, that everybody has access to resources, because we may know along the line around this employee life cycle, know someone who's going through something, or at least have the ability to utilize inclusive language to bring people in and explore some of these important conversations in the workplace. So thank you so much all, everyone, for joining in the chat, for sharing your thoughts, and Doug, Jolinda, Jude, for landing these beautiful, I say multiple mic drop moments, and you again, Lisa Marie, for holding that space. Please, we'll stop sharing and we'll pop on the screen something we really would love for you all to do is please give us some feedback. There's a little survey that we want to share with you, just for us to kind of keep evaluating the impact of these conversations, and also really gauge where we go to next, the topics that we bring forward, and also aligning in terms of relevance and what you want to hear being brought forward. Next week, to wrap up, I'm really excited to continue these conversations. We'll be exploring intergenerational wisdom. And I think that there's a really interesting piece here in connecting with those, the giants who stand before us, who've been advocating before. We even had the words to actually define ourselves and our identity, the role that plays in mentoring and queer leadership development. We're really excited to bring some awesome speakers to the forefront of this discussion. But in the meantime, please share your comments, share your feedback, connect with us on socials, share more about this conversation. The recording will be made available as well. So please share that within your network, really bring those resources and tools and ideas as well to others who definitely need it, because it's about all of us. So I'm going to pause here and really say last round of thank yous for everyone. We're excited to see you next week, and yeah, rounding this off again beautifully. So see you soon, everyone. Bye.